On behalf of the Gulf International Forum, I'd like to welcome you to Media Meddling, How Gulf States Are Doubling Down on Dissent. You know, before I introduce our panel, and we've got a great panel today, I just wanted to share, I've had the good fortune to travel all over the world. I've traveled not only in the Middle East, but throughout Asia and Africa. And what fascinates me is the various forms of communication. When I lived in Ghana, for example, radio was the primary means by which people would get their message out, by which the public would communicate back. And there are different levels of allowance, different level of restriction, different level of what is monitored in the way of communication, depending on where you are around the world. On Inauguration Eve in 2017, the night before Donald Trump was sworn in as President of the United States, I went around the city of Washington, D.C., and I went to different events, but I talked to different people on the street as well. And there was one young woman who was holding a sign that had an obscenity and then had Donald Trump's name. And I asked her, I said, why are you upset with the new president? And she said, I don't like the oppression here in America. And I smiled and I said, have you traveled anywhere outside the United States? And she said, no, but it doesn't matter. Oppression is oppression. And the irony wasn't lost on me that she could stand in the nation's capital with a sign that was obscene about the incoming president, and no one would say a word to her. And yet she thought she was being oppressed. And so different places around the world have different perceptions, but they also have different realities. The president, Donald Trump, has, for better or for worse, mastered using social media. And he has literally tens of millions of followers, and he can bypass the CNNs and other news agencies of the world and get his message out. You may like his message or you may not, but he's gotten his message directly to the people. And most of the world, of course, has these same tools now. And the question becomes, do governments use these tools of social media to communicate? Do they use these tools to surveil their people? You throw in things like fake accounts and automated bots and so on. And social media, of course, is not always used for good. The Gulf states have high end as far as technology in many of the countries, but the discussion today is how they use it. We've got a great panel, 3 great panelists, and what I'm going to do is introduce each one at a time, let them say some introductory comments, and then I will share who the next panelist is. And at the conclusion of their comments, we'll take a question and answer from everyone who is attending. Our first panelist is Dr. Shafiq Gabra. He is a professor of political science at Kuwait University and founding president of Jusur Arabia, which focuses on youth leadership programs and strategic planning. He's a former founding president of the American University of Kuwait and is going to talk to us today about the motives for some of the Gulf states to use social media in the realm of politics, or are they using it to crack down on dissidents? How is that impacting intellectuals? How has that changed the political spectrum and free speech in the GCC? Dr. Ghabra.
Well, I mean, let me give a small background, and you can stop me whenever you think is appropriate. You see, the Arab world in 2011 experienced the Arab Spring. Before the Arab Spring, we did not know in the region bots or trolls or the social media was available, but not yet. The Egyptians, before the revolution, did create a group of 500 were supposed to focus on the activists, all kinds of activists on the social media. And those 500, led by Mr. Mahmoud Ibrahim, who is still in Egypt, well-known in the media today, focused on understanding the Iranian experience, which took place earlier, during the elections. And they realized that it may not be Facebook, but Twitter. So they focused on Twitter. So basically, the focus was in a certain direction, mostly on Twitter, but the revolution happened through activism on Facebook. And they were behind the times. I think with the counter-revolution, 2012, 2013 in particular, and beyond, several states in the region started to realize that by controlling the space, by controlling the social media, they can control reality. And that reality can change, and opinion can change. And that's how this all evolved. So we could see that in so many crises today. We could see it in the Qatar crisis, for example, as a major issue where trolls and bots played a role. Now, what are bots? What are trolls? Bots, B-O-T-S, are automated, are basically like robots. It's a program, and it answers automatically and engages you in a certain way automatically. It can create trends. It can, and then you have, on the other hand, the trolls of individuals who could use the most worst racist language with the intention of intimidation, bullying. It's a bullying approach, and that's what we have. And they could create trends, and you could think that there is an avalanche, that public opinion is all going in a certain direction, and it is not. The reality is totally opposite. This has happened on the deal of the century. It's giving an impression that the public opinion supports it, while it doesn't. It gives up an impression regarding activists, regarding freedom of expression. It's a bullying technique. It's a control method. It is authoritarianism taken all the way into the space, taken all the way to Twitter, Facebook, you name it. And it also brings the research, some of your something you've said 10 years ago, and then out of context. A book you have published and out of context. It is a campaign that is intended to disinform. It is intended to create fake reality and then present it as the truth, as the reality. And therefore, there is a take and give. There is a lot of resistance to this. However, it depends. In many states today, laws of expression are becoming more vicious. Prison sentences, long-term prison sentences. So the trolls and the bots do have an open space today to say what they want to say as much as they need, retweet as much as they need, and many of the activists are very careful what to say and when to say, and many of them are going into other kinds of groups and solidarity gatherings and small WhatsApp groups as a result of feeling that the social media, Twitter, Facebook, among other places, Instagram, etc., is becoming is invaded by a virus called trolls and bots, is invaded by all of those who are trying to bully people and make them make mistakes that will take them to law and court. It's very strong in the region. I know the Russians were the first to be very strong in it and continue to be. We've seen that in the 2016 elections, but the Serbs as well. The Egyptians have developed this. So some of the accounts, even you will find in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and other places, are located in Egypt. Twitter is making its own investigation. We need to create more awareness about this in order to create a more neutral space. However, laws in many of the states in our region, and probably in many countries in the world, make it easier for trolls and bots that are government supported. And there are departments within governments that make sure the space, the social media is not functioning for activists or for real discussion and a real debate between different opinions, but rather being totally bullied in order to close that space. Many spaces are being closed in the real world, in expression, in speaking minds, and in writing, and so many, but also in the social media. But to me, I see this as closing so many spaces to the point where an explosion could happen. And that's the story of our region. I will end here, and then I'm open for any questions.
Great, thank you, Doctor. We will be back with questions when we hear from the other two panelists as well. Our second panelist is Dr. Marc Owen Jones. He is the Assistant Professor in Middle East Studies and Digital Humanities at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Dr. Jones' research spans a number of topics from historical revisions, post-colonialism, and revolutionary cultural production to policing, digital authoritarianism, human rights, and more. Dr. Jones is interested in strategies of control that affect people's life chances in the service of elite power maintenance. Marc, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the invite. It's great to be here virtually. So the two things I'm really going to be talking about is the impact of disinformation on public opinion, which I'll talk about very briefly, and also the various methods of disinformation. Firstly, I'll start with what is the impact of disinformation on public opinion. This question gets asked a lot, and really I find it quite amusing, because if you ask the question, what impact does disinformation have on public opinion, you're actually asking the question, what impact does information have on public opinion? Which is a question that would be seen as quite absurd. So, in order to answer this question, we're asking multiple questions. What is the psychology of people? What is the receptiveness to certain information? What methods of information allow people to absorb certain ideas, and that kind of thing? So it's kind of a broad question. Broadly speaking, we can say there have been increasing studies done on this. The evidence is sketchy. In some instances, people find that disinformation doesn't work, but then again, it depends on the method. It depends people's pre-existing beliefs. There is a tendency for confirmation bias, where people tend to agree with ideas that they already believe to be true. And there's also things like repetition. Repetition is increasingly, people are more likely to agree with something that they've heard more times, or at least heard once before. These are just some examples. But then there's, I think it would be specious to argue that disinformation doesn't have an effect. Essentially, if you find someone who believes certain things, whether it's that 5G causes coronavirus, or that if when Britain left the EU that they would have all this extra money for the NHS, that anyone who believed that is technically believing disinformation, right? So we know that there's an effect. It's trying to correlate the effect with specific actions taken on or offline. What is it that really convinces people to a certain line of reasoning? So it's still a very nascent field, and determining how information affects people's beliefs is obviously a very broad question. But I want to focus more, again, on the techniques of disinformation, because in terms of information availability, the whole point of disinformation is to reduce the amount of quality, factual information that exists out there. And that's one of the problems we have in terms of, if we look at effects, disinformation, the whole point of it is to crowd out legitimate or factual or credible information. And that's one of the problems we have, particularly in the Middle East social media sphere. So I think Dr. Shafeeq already mentioned some tactics. I'll just start with a few definitions that might be useful. Firstly, it's important to make a brief distinction between disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is the spreading of incorrect information with the intention of misleading. So disinformation has intent. Misinformation, on the other hand, is the sharing of incorrect information, but without the intent. So you could share it by mistake. So there's an important distinction between those two terms that can be very useful. With that in mind, then Dr. Shafeeq already mentioned the difference between bots and trolls. These are obviously prevalent online in the Arab world. Bots, I would say, automated accounts that spread information, the way they usually work is to promote certain messages. So they might retweet, for example, a piece of information that seemed to be useful for whoever is behind that particular bot farm. They can also do things like manipulate Twitter's or social media algorithms to promote certain content ahead of others. So if you wanted something to trend online, you get a lot of bots to promote a specific hashtag. And that would allow that information to trend. And trending is important because trend, again, is about information salience. If something increases its salience in a Twitter trend, not only is it becoming more prominent, but it's demoting other trends that may be legitimate or organic. So that's a huge problem we see. And that functions as a form of censorship. Trolls, I think, are a harder problem to tackle because trolls usually are real people. So these can be real people they could just be malicious individuals who have a grievance with a particular person. But I think what the issue more of us are worried about, what it seems to be more common, is quote unquote state-sponsored trolls, groups of people acting together to intimidate usually activists, analysts, journalists who are critical of specific regimes. Now these exist in large numbers. And what we're seeing particularly in Arabic is the mass mobilization of thousands of accounts to promote certain smear campaigns against individuals or certain disinformation tropes. Dr. Shafeeq, he mentioned, for example, the idea of legitimizing the deal of the century, that there's this idea that the deal of the century proposed by Kushner was popular because it trended on social media and saw a groundswell of popular opinion. I mean, firstly, it was likely there was a lot of trolls and bots manipulating that information. But secondly, there's actually no way or no easy way to verify whether or not the people promoting that campaign are actually credible. So there's a verification issue. That's a particularly bad issue. The past year, I mean, I'll talk about some contemporary case studies that are particularly interesting. Because if we look at an influence campaign is in its entirety multiple methods, including bots, trolls, and other forms that are designed to promote a specific message. This year alone, in May 2020, we saw an incredible campaign, actually, that started on Twitter, which claimed that there'd been a coup d'etat in Qatar. What actually happened on early in the morning is that someone started posting videos that claimed that were gunshots near Doha. And soon thousands of accounts were basically spreading different videos that showed gunshots and said that there was a coup. And before we knew it, this was picked up in the Independent Arabia, CNN Arabic, certain commentators from Sky News Arabia, real people, were then talking about the rumors of a coup in Qatar. And very quickly we were able to debunk these videos and show that the videos used in these kind of leaks were actually taken from several years before. But this campaign carried on for 2 weeks. And it generated hundreds of thousands of tweets. It also generated dozens of articles in Arabic language content. And it was very interesting because even some of the more kind of conservative coverage was talking about rumors of a coup in Doha. Now, even by reporting the fact that there were rumors of a coup in Doha, you're actually fulfilling the objectives of the propagandist. Because the objective of the propagandist probably isn't to convince people that there was a coup in Doha. It's merely to promote the idea that there's potential instability, for example, in Qatar, which in the current political situation would reflect the kind of desires of the Quartet countries, who obviously want to promote the idea that their blockade is successful and having an impact, and that Qatar is being destabilized. So really, like when what's very interesting is when news outlets report these disinformation campaigns, they have to be careful. Because simply by reporting that there were rumors of a coup, you're actually you're perpetuating that disinformation. When in fact you need to be reporting that there was a disinformation campaign promoting the notion of a coup instead, which is quite bizarre. And another example to draw on the notion of trolls, because I think trolling is a clear example of how we see disinformation, or at least behaviors online, silencing people who might be critical. Recently, the Washington Post, Ghada Orais, who's an Al Jazeera journalist, and Ola Al-Faris, another Al Jazeera journalist, were subjected to industrial-scale smear campaign online. And in this, they had thousands of accounts in the space of a few hours, basically attacking them online, spreading doctored photos and doctored tweets attributed to them. These were then being promoted, in this particular instance, by influencers in the Arab world, mostly Saudis. And a lot of these influencers were also the same influencers you saw in previous disinformation campaigns. They were promoting essentially factually incorrect information that attempted to, quote unquote, slut shame two Al Jazeera journalists, women Al Jazeera journalists, with fake news. And again, this information was picked up by legacy media in terms of CNN Arabic. And if you speak to any journalist who's subjected to these attacks, they'll have different opinions. But in this case, some people admit that it does have an effect. There is a chilling effect. If you're constantly getting harassed online and people are creating or even hacking your phone to share photos, as happened in this case, then I have spoke to several journalists or activists who've said, yeah, it does have an effect. Sometimes it makes you think twice before tweeting something. Sometimes it makes you fearful. Sometimes you think, I don't want my children to see this, so maybe I'll back down, right? People have families, they react differently. And finally, I just want to give a more recent example about disinformation, because again, Dr. Shafeeq talked about the beginning of 2011 when the Arab uprising started. And again, there was probably more an element of hope at that point about how social media could function as an important tool to build trust between activists and hold governments accountable. But the trajectory we're seeing, obviously, is somewhat different. We're seeing increasing use of social media as a space of repression and intimidation. But this is not a parochial issue to the Middle East. I think what's very curious now is myself and Adam Rawnsley, a journalist at the Daily Beast, this month, at the beginning of this month, we did an investigation. We found this incredible disinformation campaign, and this represented a new level of kind of audacity. We essentially found that around 25 fake journalists had produced about 70 articles or op-eds and distributed them in around 40 to 45 international news outlets, right? So these journalists who didn't actually exist, but were operating fake Twitter accounts, fake LinkedIn accounts, were producing content, articles, and then giving them to numbers of outlets, from the Washington Examiner to Spiked Online to the Asia Times, South China Morning Post, pretty reputable outlets. And they were publishing these articles because they assumed that the people sending them were real people or real journalists and real analysts. But these people didn't exist. So for the past 6 months, potentially thousands of people have read articles that were written by people who didn't exist and whose provenance we do not know. However, we do know that there's articles which were mainly targeted at an English-speaking audience, mainly targeted at conservative American news sites, reflected the foreign policy agenda of, most likely, for example, the United Arab Emirates. So this is kind of local politics, local foreign policy objectives going global. We're seeing attempts from the region, from the Middle East, to try and influence, for example, policies in the US, or at least public opinion in the US, ahead of the US elections. So we have to remember that this is not just a parochial issue. It's not just the Russians who are trying to interfere in the US elections, or the Chinese, or the vice versa. We have what looks like Middle Eastern elements trying to influence foreign policy in Europe and North America. So we have to be mindful of that too, and that's not going away. And I think the most frightening thing about this recent campaign is that half of the journalists were using Facebook photos, for example, of real people, but the other half were using AI-generated images. So images generated by machine learning that create very believable human faces that are unique, and that are it's very easy to do this. You can just go to a website and create a fake account from scratch, a fake face, a fake image that looks very plausible, and create fake accounts. So they were doing this in a way that makes it very hard to trace. So there's been lots of questions raised about how artificial intelligence is going to impact the next level of disinformation, especially with deepfakes. So we're already seeing this starting to happen in the form of crude fake accounts using believable human images. So the techniques are changing, they're adapting. The scale of the operation is always hard to determine, because obviously there's a lot of disinformation out there that exists that we don't know of until we obviously discover it. And usually disinformation campaigns occur at important times in history. So the upcoming US elections is obviously going to be a big one. And so I'd expect to see a rise in disinformation in the region and targeting the US. So thank you.
Dr. Jones, thank you for your comments. The irony, your final point there, the irony is there's more news available from more sources than ever before, but news organizations are having trouble figuring out how to make money distributing it. So their staff, as far as editorial or fact checking or doing their homework, is getting smaller and smaller, which makes itself more susceptible to the idea of what you just described, where people are planting fake news and very little is done in the way of homework to try to verify that news they are simply planning. Your point is spot on. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Our third panelist, Dr. Sahar Khamis. She is the associate professor in the Department of Communication and an affiliate professor in the Department of Women's Studies and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity at the University of Maryland in College Park. She's an expert on Arab and Muslim media and former head of the Mass Communication Department at Qatar University. She is a former Mellon Islamic Studies Initiative visiting professor at the University of Chicago, and she is the co-author of several books, numerous book chapters, journal articles, and conference papers in both English and Arabic. She will talk to us today about tools used by government apparatuses in the Gulf states to undermine the role of media and social media, and how different governments and security apparatuses are dealing with dissent on social media. Dr. Khamis.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Tim, and thanks so much to Gulf International Forum for this opportunity to participate in this important and timely panel. My remarks today will center around 4 double-edged sword effects or processes going on, and then I'm going to wrap up with a trajectory for where that takes us from here. So the first double-edged sword effect really has been the impact of social media or the process of cyber activism, which I have been writing a lot about in the last number of years since the eruption of the Arab Spring specifically, on the region as a whole, and then I'll move on to talk about the Gulf region in particular, and then I will zoom in on women and gender dimension as an affiliate professor of women's studies, and then I'm going to have some remarks as well on the coronavirus and its impact on this whole process of digital surveillance and digital tracing of activists, and wrap up with the future trajectory of all of that. So starting with the Arab region as a whole, there is no question that in 2011, there was not only a case of hope, but there was even what we can call techno-euphoria, digital euphoria. People were like very hopeful that social media is going to become this liberating tool. It's going to try to bring about democracy, democratization, liberation. The activists are going to become very vocal. They're going to be talking very loudly. The regimes will not be able to intercept or to interrupt their efforts. Unfortunately, fast forward 9 years, now we are in 2020, and we are seeing that a lot of that has been more or less, quote unquote, illusionary, maybe except for the unique case of Tunisia that sometimes we refer to as the Tunisian, quote unquote, Tunisian exceptionalism. Other than that, we have seen how there have been detours, unfortunately, in the so-called Arab Spring countries, and the role of social media here is very vital. At the beginning in 2011, the regimes really kind of lagged behind. They were behind the activists, they were behind the people who were fighting for freedom. They did not know that these tools are really going to be used in this kind of unique way, and they were just watching and they were just in awe. Some of them acted in panic, as we saw, for example, in the case of Egypt, the shutting down of the internet completely for a whole week, the cutting off of the cell phone service for a whole week, all of that stuff which really backfired. After that, the regime started to pick up and they started to build their own learning curves. So we saw, for example, the Syrian Electronic Army in the case of Syria, which is going after the activists online and trying to find out their locations, their IP addresses, trying to hack them, trying to sabotage their activities online, and in some extreme cases, as we have seen in the case of one Libyan activist, even going after them physically in the real world and endangering their own lives. So things did not go as planned, and as the regimes build their own learning curves moving forward, we're seeing more evidence of quote-unquote digital authoritarianism, or what we can really describe as a digital counter-revolution. That is not what has been hoped for with the whole idea or the whole phenomena of media euphoria that prevailed back in 2011. Now, if we zoom in specifically on the Gulf region in particular, we will see that it's a region that has a lot of resources. So unlike many of the Arab countries that suffer from infrastructure constraints, economic problems, a lot of hardships, lack of maybe sufficient internet penetration or technological availability, that is not the case in the Gulf region, being a region that has a very high, income level for its individuals, very high standard of living, a lot of economic affluence, and also a lot of infrastructure and availability of technology. That again became the second double-edged sword. In a way, yes, it gave the activists and the young people who represent a very high percentage of the demographics in the Gulf region. We know that more than 75% of the Arab region is under the age of 30. You look at the Gulf in particular, and this number can come close to 90%, which is really something which is like, amazing. It means that these young people are the ones who are using social media the most. They're technologically savvy, they're active both online and offline. But of course, in the case of the Arab world, the offline or on-the-ground activism is proving to be extremely dangerous. So a lot of these young people take to social media as a platform to express their views and to express their activism and sometimes even their opposition. But this, at the same time, also turned out to be a double-edged sword, because on the other hand, that has given Gulf states at the same time a lot of potential in order to crack down on dissent and on opposition. And we have seen numerous examples of that. We have seen, for example, the only country in the Gulf region that witnessed the Arab uprising, which is Bahrain, how the Bahraini government has been very effective in terms of trying to, quote unquote, hush down the uprising, so much so that some people even refer to it as the forgotten uprising, or the forgotten revolution. The people do not talk about it as much because there have been very successful efforts on the part of the regime, using public relations companies all over the world, but also using their own social media potential to try to paint a completely different picture and a completely different image than the real one on the ground, even in some cases showing some kind of fabricated images for some of the Bahraini activists, raising slogans and saying things and banners that they did not do and did not say. So there was this element of fabrication or disinformation for sure. There was even going after some of these activists, like Umar Abdul Aziz, the famous of course dissident in the case of Saudi Arabia, who has been complaining of the efforts to hack into his phone and trace him and break into his own private information and data, endangering him. There was the Twitter spy scandal, whereby some former Twitter employees were convicted of spying on behalf of the Saudi government in order to hack into certain accounts of opponents and try to expose their identity, which really endangers their lives. So the examples are so numerous and we can go on and on, but the gist of the point here is this kind of advantage economically, infrastructurally, has been a double-edged sword for the Gulf region. We move to point number 3, which is the gender dimension or the women's dimension, which I'm very interested in and has prevailed a lot in my research agenda, unsurprisingly. I think it's very important to also note that this has been a very important double-edged sword for women activists in particular, and also in the Gulf region, if we zoom in on this particular region. It has given women unique opportunities to speak up, to make their voices heard, to make their identities visible in ways that would not have been possible had it not been for social media. So some activists I've been interviewing from Bahrain and from other Arab countries would say things like, social media has been a window through which we can see the rest of the world, but also allow the rest of the world to see us at the same time simultaneously. So that has been a very strong tool, a very strong potential for young women activists to take onto social media, sometimes in traditional societies where they cannot have the advantage of going out on the street and doing some kind of on-the-street activism because of certain traditional and social constraints. But they can take onto their own Twitter feed and their own blogs and their own Facebook pages, and they can there, tweet their opinions and their ideas openly and free. However, having said that, that has also been a double-edged sword in a way, because the more your visibility increases, the more the crackdown can also happen. The more visible you are, the more followers you have on social media, the more famous you are as a name in the realm of activism, the more you endanger yourself with this kind of public appearance. And that's exactly what happened with some of the activists in the Gulf region in general, and some of the women activists in particular. We have seen the cases of Manal Sharif, who launched the Women to Drive campaign in the case of Saudi Arabia. We have seen, Zainab al-Khawaja and others in Bahrain. We have seen the cases of, activists being actually imprisoned and jailed in the cases of Bahrain and the cases of Saudi Arabia. And, ironically enough, there was this effort, in Saudi Arabia to paint this image like, we're trying to fight for quote unquote women's reform issues and women's rights at the time when women who were fighting for these same issues, like women's rights, were actually taken to jail and imprisoned. So that's another double-edged sword. The fourth double-edged sword I want to talk about is the coronavirus pandemic, which is impacting every single aspect of our lives right now as we speak. There's no question about it. We'd have been all together now in the same room, probably in Washington, D.C., talking to each other rather than being on a Zoom virtual forum that has its pros and cons, but that's another discussion for another day. But coronavirus has really given, again, a potential and at the same time a threat. A potential for activists and for journalists and for young people to talk and to speak and to spread information. But sometimes there is the danger of, as well, misinformation or disinformation that Marc has touched upon. You know, this can be one potential danger, that not every piece of information which is being shared on social media is always necessarily proven to be accurate or proven to be correct. There is always room for misinformation or disinformation as well. But if you look at the regimes in power, there is also this danger of additional and very intensive authoritarianism online, a very strong governmental effort to crack down on information and to shape everything according to, quote unquote, the official governmental narrative. Governments do not want any kind of contestation or any kind of opposition to their own official governmental narrative. And if you stray away from this line, you can face very harsh consequences. And these consequences could be even as worse as, you know, as imprisonment. We have seen journalists who go to jail, they're being imprisoned. We have seen journalists who have been expelled or lost their credentials because they've written something that the government did not agree with or did not like about coronavirus pandemic or the numbers and figures related to this case. You add to this also the fact that the Gulf region has all of these resources and affluence we have talked about before, and you see, for example, something like contact tracing. Contact tracing can open the door as well for invasion of privacy, for surveillance, right? It can protect you from, you know, from being exposed to the virus. That's the ideal purpose of contact tracing. But it can also open the doors for governmental intervention and crackdown, invading your own privacy in ways that have been unprecedented before. And that is much more applicable if you have more resources, like in the Gulf region. We have seen the electronic armies online. We have seen all of these different examples. So with the coronavirus pandemic, then the danger of invasion of privacy and the danger of surveillance and intrusion into the activist account and compromising their own safety and protection becomes more real with the coronavirus pandemic and efforts like contact tracing. And I'll end with this note that we are now moving through different phases. So from the phase of techno euphoria or digital euphoria that we have all been in some way or another participating in 2011, myself included. I've written a lot about, you know, cyber activism and cyber feminism and how these processes are excellent and they're giving women new potential and activists are prevailing. We move to the other extreme of the, you know, digital counter-revolution, or even some people will say digital pessimism, right? Oh my God, the social media are now being used as authoritarian tools. They're being used as tools to hack and to invade people's privacy and to compromise their security and safety and even to imprison them or even to trace them and kill them. So we're now in a moment of digital pessimism. I think we should go to the middle ground of digital realism or cyber realism, not cyber optimism or cyber pessimism, but the favorable middle ground of cyber realism. We should realize the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages, the potentials and the threats of social media, try to make the most out of them while minimizing the dangerous outcomes and threats. Thank you so much.
Dr. Khamis, thank you very much. I appreciate it. A reminder to everyone with us, if you have questions, if you scroll down to the bottom of the screen, there is a little space that says Q&A. And so if you have any question for any of our panelists or all of our panelists, please type it in there and we will make an effort to get every question answered. Let me start with one for Dr. Jones. And Dr. Khamis just said there is clearly great potential with social media and with technology, but there is also a threat with that. Marc, when you look at this, is social media, particularly in the Gulf region, is it a net positive or is it a net negative with the current governmental structures?
I mean, if I was to answer this quickly and simply, I would say it's probably a net negative in terms of political activism. I think the political structures, the political systems have to change to some degree before social media can have a viable effect on civil society. The trajectory we're seeing now is worrying. I mean, especially coming out of some of the most popular Gulf countries like Saudi, we're seeing a co-opted space in which key influencers and a various amount of anonymous accounts seem to be the ones able to express their opinions openly. And so I would say the trajectory is negative, and I can't see social media toppling the embedded regimes. I don't think it's that powerful, and I think it's been co-opted to such an extent that it's impossible.
Next question is for Dr. Ghabra. Has the politics of the Gulf region changed since the increase in this online harassment, fake profiles, attacks on people, has the politics changed, and if so, how?
Yes, it has changed tremendously. We're in a more difficult situation, more intensive situation between opinions. This is the first time I remember at that level of intensity where there are many Arab exiles and now Gulf exiles as well. Many of them in Istanbul, many of them in Turkey, many of them in London, many of them in other places. And there are intensive debates between them. And they have come together from different countries. And I see an awareness that is going beyond just the nation state. And that is a changer that we may see over time, where you will find individuals from particular Arab and Gulf countries think about their countries, but also think about the region. They realize even if their country becomes the most democratic country in the world, if they live within another 20 states that are non-democratic or another 18 states that are non-democratic, their democracy will be destroyed. And therefore, there is a feeling of regionalism all over again, that for change to happen, we need to think local and regional, but also international. So there's a new brand, a new breed, a new type of activists in the making at the grassroots level, who some of them are still in the social media, but it depends where they live, and they have programs. And therefore, the social media is also being used by the opposition, by the other opinions. And many of them are aware now. They don't need to engage all the trolls and bots and whoever, all the bullies and all the microaggressions and racism that is manufactured by intelligence operations and Ministry of Information operations in various countries. Though the leading is Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates, but you will find this also at different levels. You'll find someone who is very powerful, but not necessarily part of a government, but is powerful. You find someone who is part of a deep state, who is playing with this, who is seeking that. So yes, the politics have changed. People today, more than ever, are looking forward for reforms. There was a question that I saw regarding regime changes. Gulf societies are fearful of regime changes after regime changes in other places in the region. Yet, they are not fearful of reform, and reform could be meaningful and deep. And the more states get in trouble financially, economically, corona, non-corona, the more divisions there are, the more these issues of reform surface again, even by individuals who are part of the regimes, but on the more open, on the more who look more for a better formula for their country between state and society, or looking for a new contract. So yes, there are changes, and there are plenty of them. And the status quo is very difficult to maintain as is. I mean, wars, Corona, Yemen war, the Qatar siege, Libyan civil war, Iraq civil war, Syrian civil war, the crisis in Egypt, though it may not look very intensive, but it is at the grassroots level very intensive and very serious. People's lives are being destroyed over a statement or a book or a translation or a opposition. People go in and out of prison, but they go in more than they go out. So there is a lot of things that are happening in our part of the world. And that whole issue of bots and trolls and the social media is also something that many of those who have a different opinion are aware of and trying to create a balance of power. And I agree a lot with Dr. Sahar that we need to look at the medium, and we need to look at the middle way by which it can help and by which we don't engage those who are clearly not really representing themselves or representing any genuine opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Ghabra. Just a reminder, it's just a great panel we have here, and this is a unique opportunity to ask them any question related to social media, to the Gulf states. So please take advantage of it. Question and answer is down at the bottom of your screen. If you click on there, you type in the question, and we'll make sure it gets asked. Our next question is for Dr. Khamis. How has social media and the use of bots changed the Arab youth movement? Dr. Khamis.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the Arab youth movement, of course, at the beginning, as we said, there was this moment of techno euphoria, and people were really taking to social media, and a lot of the activists were using social media very extensively. You know, they had their own blogs, they had their own Facebook pages, they had their own, you know, Twitter feeds. Now we are seeing a lot of governmental instruments which are being deployed. You know, that you can have trolls, you can have bots, you can have, you know, invasion of privacy, you can have, we said, contact tracing, you can have so many other tools. And the irony or the paradox, as we explained, is that the more there is more technological savviness on the part of the regime and more capital, economically and technologically and so on, the more there is going to be threats to the young activists and those who are using social media platforms. We gave the example of electronic armies, for example, in the case of number of Gulf countries like you know, Saudi Arabia and so on. We can go on and on with so many examples. But in the interest of time, just let me say that a lot of this social media activism is now taking different forms. And a lot of young people also, some of them are saying, like, you know, is it even safe to be on social media, which is a very dangerous point, a very dangerous thing to be, a dangerous position to be in. And some of them say, oh my God, you know, there is this activist who has been imprisoned in Bahrain just because of a tweet, right? Nabil Rajab, he was just, you know, imprisoned because of a tweet, something I always tell my students at the University of Maryland here in the United States, and I say, you know, just think of how lucky you are that, you know, in some other parts of the world, you can go to jail just because of a tweet. In some other countries, because of a blog or because of something you have written on Facebook. Definitely, if you expand beyond the Gulf region, you go to a country like Egypt, and you see there is also a very high price associated with social media activism. So some people decided, like, okay, I'm going to leave the whole platform. I know some very famous, you know, prominent bloggers who decided to stop blogging and tweeting altogether because they felt like, as we said before, the more visible you are and the more publicly renowned you are and the more known and famous your name is, the more the dangers are also going to increase and the threats are going to accumulate even more. And that's definitely the case with some of the Arab activists. Some of them decided to have their activity completely in exile, like the Saudi dissident Omar Abdulaziz and others who decided, you know, I'm going to be active and vocal on social media, but I'm going to do it in exile. And some of them, unfortunately, were not even fortunate to be in any of these positions because they ended up, you know, behind bars. They ended up in jail or in prison, or in some extreme cases, they even lost their own lives as a result of their activism. So I would say that, you know, no matter what kind of instrument or tool the government is using, the ultimate result in some cases becomes that there are two different effects here. Again, another double-edged sword. Some activists feel more, you know, defiant and more resilient and more, you know, determined to really spread the word and to make sure that activism is heightened to another level and their voice is louder and clearer, while others, unfortunately, end up in much less fortunate positions, either stopping their social media activism altogether, or, you know, halting their activities, or doing it from exile, or unfortunately being, you know, imprisoned, or even being killed. Let me just say something quickly I did not have time to say in my remarks, which is about the effect is not just about the local domain. I think Dr. Shafeeq mentioned that the regional as well as the international impact is also something very important that we should point out. Like when you talk about something like the Gulf blockade on the state of Qatar, for example, there is a lot that can be written and said about how this level of, you know, use of social media by different governments is not just deployed or used against the local, you know, domestic population or their own people, but it goes beyond that. It has regional effects and it has also international effects and implications. And one unique example, of course, that we can see in the case of the Gulf region is the Gulf blockade crisis against Qatar. And we can talk about how social media has been deployed and used by different states in order to sometimes spread disinformation or misinformation and to try to, you know, tarnish the image of the state of Qatar and to paint it as, quote unquote, you know, hosting terrorism or whatever these, you know, claims are, in order to really increase the divide and the polarization. And unfortunately, some of these efforts work and some people believe them and they start to propagate them or to spread them in social media, again, creating this vicious interconnected cycle, which is very dangerous for everyone.
We'll do a speed round now. I have a question that will go to all three panelists. And so if each of you would take, a minute or a minute and a half to answer this one as best you can. The question reads, we've heard a lot about the quartet today, but what about the other Gulf states like Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman, and the use of social media to crack down on local dissent? How open are those countries to public opposition to the regime? Let's start with Dr. Ghabra. Ghabra.
Well, you know, we can say a lot, right? Regimes in the region they may look alike, but they are not exactly alike. Some have more tolerance, some have less tolerance, some have a sense of civil society, some tolerate independent expression. And I'll give an example from Kuwait. In Kuwait, despite the fact that we've witnessed a certain retreat from many of the freedoms, many Kuwaitis had before 2011, yet Kuwait, it allowed, and therefore we continue to have a vibrant civil society, we continue to have multiplicity of opinion, we continue to have very critical opinion of government. There is a law today that is more strict regarding the social media, and many have taken, have went to court and gotten cases. It's yet the country remained in the middle when it comes to all of this. And therefore, we do have a vibrant expression that continues to exist and to play a role on the social media. It's not like before, 5-6 years ago, but it is still vibrant and important. Now, I realize that when we look at countries, people are looking for changes of laws, changes of the entire the way government is formed, changing of election laws wherever there is election. These debates today exist in Kuwait regarding where we go from here and where we go after Corona. But such issues are all over the place. And so when you look at Qatar, Oman, there is more tolerance, relatively speaking, when you compare with countries today that have zero tolerance, actually minus 100 tolerance when it comes to any expression. But what is this doing? In places where there is no tolerance, it's basically pushing people underground. It's pushing some serious activists to hide. But when they hide, they don't stop their activism. We've learned this from the history of revolution. We've learned this from all kinds of social movements. People continue their activism. And I'm aware that there are many activists who really kind of slowed down, but they really didn't slow down. They continue the debate and the intensity of their work, and they want to see change and reform, democracy, and a better Arab society. And they are from the Gulf as much as they are from the rest of the region. And some in the countries, some outside the countries. People are now taking note of the kind of repression that they are experiencing and trying to outsmart it and trying to know how to deal with it. So we're really ending up with hardcore reformers who are made as a result of 211, 212, 213, even 216, 17, the counter-revolution, etc. These are hardcore change agents that are all over the Arab world today, and they are creating this. So I see the differences. We have to look at the differences between states, and we have to kind of type it between 1 to 10, more tolerant, less tolerant, zero tolerance, and then see how we explain what is going on.
Same question to you, Dr. Jones. When you look at, say, Oman, or you look at Kuwait, or you look at Qatar, what is the level of dissent that you see those governments comfortable with?
I think, I think there's a certain threshold of intolerance for dissent in these countries. I mean, if you look at the RSF freedom rankings of any of the Gulf countries, they're not particularly great. I mean, Kuwait is the highest. Saudi is clearly the worst. But we have different political issues, as Dr. Ghabra mentioned. We can't necessarily compare apples and oranges. I would say, if I was to point out some specific examples, some of the issues that I see the most hostility to, not necessarily from governments, but certainly from other civil society actors, some feminist discourses. I often see women activists and feminist activists being attacked quite virulently, which I find somewhat disturbing and alarming. having said that, it's not always clear who is trying to discourage certain events from taking place. I analyzed the trend, a Twitter trend in Kuwait at the end of last year, I believe. And it was a manipulated campaign started by bots calling a politician, a drunk, and his supporters drunk because he was calling people to protest outside the parliament. Now, you could make an argument here that this was a political rival, or was it someone who was trying to prevent protests by, trying to smear the person who was calling for them, right? We don't necessarily know who was behind that. And this is a big problem with a lot of the online censorship that we see. We don't exactly know who is behind it or what the motives are. But I would certainly say if there's a difference between calling for reform, which there is some tolerance of, and then calling for constitutional change, which I think there's less tolerance of. But we've only really seen that in its most acute form in the Gulf, in Bahrain, where, of course, the government did crack down very brutally on dissent.
Dr. Khamis, and that is, how can anyone, is there anyone who can regulate the content, who can regulate censorship, who can regulate authoritarianism? If there is someone, who is that someone? How can we go about actually making sure that countries are not abusing their own citizens or other people of the world in an effort to promote their own agenda?
This is, I would say this is really $1 million question, let me put it this way, because there is really no simple or clear or straightforward answer to this one important and complex question. Right? There has been a lot of efforts at quote unquote what is called, social media regulation. Should we regulate the internet or should we not regulate the internet? Right? And if there is going to be a regulation, how much should there be? Who is going to impose it for sure is another question. And that is not something that I would say is unique to the to the Arab world or to the Gulf region in particular. I would say very much that this is a global issue and a global crisis right now that everybody is going through, especially when you have something like a global pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic that we are dealing with right now. We have seen, questions being raised. We have seen, alarm bells. We have seen this infodemic. There's now the term infodemic, which refers to this surge, if you will, in misinformation and disinformation, which accompanied the coronavirus pandemic, creating a surge of, sometimes falsehoods and rumors and misinformation and disinformation. And with that came the question of this, possibility of the internet regulation. I wish I had a clear and easy and simple answer, because really there isn't one, to be honest with you. Even here in the United States, we have seen President Trump, getting angry at Twitter, which is his favorite platform. We know he tweets more than anyone else, of course, but when Twitter, flags some of his tweets for not being factual, or the need for fact checking and all of that stuff, he gets angry and he says, we should really regulate Twitter and we should regulate Facebook. And I'm like, good luck. There has been no easy way to find one mechanism of regulation. And to your point, regulation by whom? And who's going to be this regulator? And who's going to accept this kind of regulation? These are all questions that remain pretty much up in the air. And I'm afraid there are more questions than answers around this particular sensitive and important issue, unfortunately.
One more question for all three of you, and that is the COVID crisis. We've talked about it a little bit here, but it has driven people indoors. It has driven people more than ever before into the digital world. We are more dependent. This meeting would be the perfect example. We are more dependent on technology and on the digital world than we've ever been. Does that set itself up politically, particularly in the Gulf states, as a good thing or a bad thing? Does the forced use of digital technology put us more at risk in the Gulf, or does it open up more opportunity? Let's start with Dr. Jones.
It's a big question. It's obviously very early to tell. I think, for me, I find the kind of the fact that we are so dependent on technology even prior to the crisis a worrying trend, and I think that we can easily be put in a situation, as we have done with contact tracing and these COVID apps, where we sort of sleepwalk into a situation where technology is increasingly being used as a tool of surveillance over our lives, which is a problem. And I think one of the fundamental aspects of surveillance and this COVID management is the isolation of individuals into their homes and without contact. So I think there's a very dangerous notion that all this, what worries me is this very much positive talk about the world's not going to go back to how it was. Things are going to change post-COVID. We're going into this post-COVID digital age. And that alarms me, because I think a fundamental aspect of what's important for the politics of humanity is interaction and contact between people. I think it's far too easy for governments to control people when they're isolated, atomized in their little units, and not getting out in the streets if necessary to protest, whether it's Black Lives Matter or something else.
Dr. Ghabra, are we at more risk because of our dependence on digital technology and the COVID sickness?
I don't think we're at more risk. I think people are taking note of their condition. You know, there is a paradigm in the Arab world and in many states, in some Gulf states as well, that you don't need to be involved in politics. Forget politics, forget talking. Just focus on your economic well-being, and that's it. And I think that paradigm is being challenged, that humans are political animals, and humans talk and express, and when they are in pain, they scream, they express themselves, they are angry, they are frustrated, they want to see better life for them, for their kids. It's therefore this herd society where there is one leader and that's it. We've tried it with Saddam, we've tried it with Gaddafi, we tried it with Hafiz al-Assad and then his son Bashar al-Assad. We've tried it in so many places. Some in the Arab world would like to repeat the same intensity of the one leader and the only one leader who leads everybody, and nobody else is allowed to express themselves. And so there is another model in the making, which believes in balances, which believes in multiplicity of opinion, which believes in the right to form political parties, to express within certain laws, within certain understanding, who believe in the push for a level of democracy. It could be 5 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 or whatever, wherever you can. There is always a challenge, even for the most advanced democracies. And I think the aspect that Corona brings is that we're losing on the oil era. I mean, the oil era will continue, but it will not be the same as the one we have known in the past. Governments will not be able to provide to people what they always said they will provide, but don't say anything, and we're providing, and just be happy for what we are providing. That paradigm is going to change. Now, the more numerous the population, let's say a country like Saudi Arabia will have more a situation, it cannot provide as before. So it's going to go to taxes, it's going to go to, but I assume other countries in the region, oil-producing countries, for societies, to be more frustration and more expression. So I do see changes down the line, and they will become more intensive down the line. And the oil era is also changing to a different era, where other things have to come in order to have a budget and to economy. And all the issues of the oil era, it came with it a lot of corruption. And that's a big story. It's a big story in Kuwait today, but it's also a big story in the future. I think we are hopeful. We see a lot of changes coming, and the Corona has intensified, made it so intensive that that many of the contradictions that were hidden, I think, will be much more exposed in the year or 2 or 3 or 5 along the way.
Dr. Khamis, we have, earlier you talked about social media bringing both potential and bringing unique threats. When you look at people being driven indoors, when you look at people depending on digital media more than ever before, Dr. Khamis, is this creating greater potential or a greater threat? Or both?
I'll go back again to my social media analogy, my double-edged sword social media analogy, which I've used before in my own remarks when I talked about the process of cyber activism in the region and how it started with the 2011 revolutions and going on up till this present moment. I think that definitely the coronavirus pandemic offers both. It is really opening the doors for a lot of great potentials for a lot of people to explore. new ways of expressing themselves. I totally believe that the world is not going to be the same after this pandemic. I really think that it's now much different than it was before the coronavirus pandemic, and I don't see any way to really kind of roll back or go back again to the pre-coronavirus stage or phase, because I believe that now you have online education, you have online teaching, you have online journalism, you have a lot of professions really going online rather than being offline. And that is a phenomenon that I don't think is going to be reversed, or it's not going to go back again, in my opinion. So that, of course, does have its own potentials, and it does have its own potentials for activists and young people who are always constantly exploring and finding and implementing new ways for themselves to be active online and to make their opinions heard. But at the same time, there is also the threats and the dangers. Marc talked about isolation. I talked about contact tracing. There are governments who are now very innovative in terms of finding ways to hack and sabotage and trace the activists online, and to silence voices of dissent and opposition, and to go after their opponents. And all of these processes are unfortunately heightened and increased now in the coronavirus era. And I think that both sides, those who are trying to impose more restrictions and those who are trying to fight or to resist these restrictions, both of them in parallel simultaneously will try to up their game and will try to find innovative and new and creative ways in order to push their own agenda. So it's a tug of war, it's a push and pull mechanism, it's pretty much a double-edged sword, and I think it's right to say it's very paradoxical and it's very much evolving. And if we have another discussion 1 year from now, I'm sure we can have a lot to add to this whole situation and this whole crisis, and talking about its aftermath and its impact.
I like that idea. Let's put it on the calendar for 1 year from now. Each one of you will have about a minute and a half to make some don't go anywhere.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, the Arab region as a whole has been going through this double-edged sword phenomena of both potentials and threats, opportunities and limitations. And I see this very, very clear in the Gulf region, in the Gulf states in particular. In fact, the question that was posed by one of the participants today about, whether, there are other countries that have more freedom, I always look at it as a spectrum. Right? We cannot really look at it in terms of black and white. Oh my God, this country is, free, and this country is completely constrained, or vice versa. It is no secret that the Arab region as a whole does have its own challenges and constraints and limitations when it comes to issues of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, accepting dissent. All of that has been very challenging in the Arab region as a whole. And if you zoom in on the Gulf region in particular, as we said, unfortunately, the capital or the increased economic affluence and the technological availability and all of that stuff, and internet penetration levels and all of that has been in itself a double-edged sword, also allowing governments and regimes to crack down. Now, how much they crack down and to what extent they crack down, and what tools are they using in order to crack down, right? And in what shape, in what way, in what form, all of that pretty much varies from one state to another, creating this spectrum that I'm talking about. It's not a black and white phenomena, it's pretty much a spectrum. It depends on the degree of liberation or the degree of repression that you are witnessing in one country or another. And I think that's the way we need to look at it. Just very quickly, I'll say that my research agenda now is pretty much impacted by all of that. So instead of writing about the euphoria of cyber activism and cyber feminism, which dominated my research agenda until recently, I'm now shifting my interest into the issues of digital authoritarianism, in the issues of the digital counter-revolution, and how all of that is impacting both the regimes and the dissidents and the activists who are fighting against them.
Thank you very, very much. Dr. Jones, your closing comments, please.
Well, I'm very cynical, as some of you may know. So I'll keep mine relatively simple, but I think we have to be mindful of the fact that social media, technological determinism, the idea that technology is able to change things entirely on its own is misleading, right? Societies, the political systems, social structure, how people use technology matter. So the political systems will also define how social media is used. And to an extent, social media might impact those political systems. But the way I see it now, social media has been so co-opted that it's increasingly less likely to impact on the political system. So I think political change through more traditional forms of resistance if this was to happen, if there was to be reform, would happen first. And I don't necessarily think technology is going to change that. Secondly, I think the porousness of social media, the fact that non-state actors outside the region can influence politics in the region, and that people within this region can then try to attempt to influence politics outside the regions, are very important. And they're the next things that we need to focus on in terms of how we analyze social media.
And finally, with our final closing comments, Dr. Ghabra.
Well, there was a question actually by Ghaith Naqshbandi, and he said, do you see the abuse of social media also having an impact on business? And I will add on corruption, and the answer is yes. Social media has been used also to create misinformation about corruption and about businesses, and some became very fake, and then you get a collapse suddenly. So when we look at the social media, we see a struggle. Maybe at this stage, there is more authoritarianism, but if we recall the late assassinated Jamal Khashoggi was trying with an opposition member, Omar Abdulaziz, to create a group of Saudi social media who are more on the positive, on trying to create a situation where there is a more meaningful debate. I think this will happen at some point. You see, many states feel that they have everything under control. And this is very misleading for such states. It is true, nobody foresaw in the Arab regimes 2/11, and nobody will foresee the coming era and the coming changes and the coming expressions of spring and changes, and what the Arab world, Arab youth in particularly, that Sahar spoke about, the 70% under 30 want. They want a lot, and they feel they're taken into a direction that will make them live in a failed state, and they're going in a direction where they cannot even immigrate or leave after all the immigrations that took place. So people will have to fight their battles in their societies, and I see this evolving. Look around us. I mean, the Yemen war, all the civil wars in the region. So it's not only the social media. That's one part of the struggle. There is another one on the ground. Look what happened in Libya, the Turkish intervention. Then there is the Iranian. Then in other places, the Iranian intervention, but it's also the Russian intervention. And there is also, so the Arab world is going towards failed states if it does not find the right political, social, cultural, economic arrangement that can take these states into better terrain of socio-economic political realities. And that needs, by definition, to include dissent, to include all peaceful activists, whether they're Muslim brothers or Islamists or leftists or human rights activists or environmental activists. It needs to open the space to create a new pact. And without that, the struggle goes on, and the Arab world will face much instability in the years to come.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you to our entire esteemed panel. Thank you, of course, to the Gulf International Forum. And thank all of you for participating. We appreciate your interest and appreciate you taking the time. With that, we will say goodbye and good luck.